When the priest said he was a good husband and a loving father, I almost laughed. My fingers gripped the edge of my black dress so tightly that my nails left tiny half-moon marks on the fabric. Everyone around me was crying, his co-workers, our neighbors, even the mailman. They all painted him as a saint. But the truth? The truth was rotting under layers of lies. For 30 years, I was his wife. I cooked his meals, stayed up through his fevers, listened to his endless stories about business trips and late meetings. I trusted him completely. We had 2 children, a home that always smelled like coffee and fresh paint, and a marriage that, to outsiders, looked unshakable. When he died, suddenly of a heart attack, I thought my world had ended. I felt hollow, like someone had scooped out my insides and left me standing in my own shadow. But even in that darkness, I told myself at least he loved me. At least we had each other. That lie kept me breathing. Until the funeral. It started with a whisper, a young woman standing near the back of the church, holding a little boy's hand. I didn't recognize her. She was in her late 20s, trembling, her eyes red and swollen. I thought maybe she was just one of his distant clients or employees. But when she stepped forward during the eulogy, my stomach turned cold. I just want to say, she began, her voice breaking, that Robert was the best father my son could ever have. Father. The word echoed in my ears like a gunshot. Every head in the church turned. The boy next to her, he had Robert's eyes. The same hazel color. The same dimple on the left cheek. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. The air felt heavy with humiliation, grief, and something worse, rage. She looked straight at me when she said, I know this is hard for everyone, but we loved him too. I stumbled out of the church before anyone could stop me. The cold air outside hit me like a slap. 30 years of love, loyalty, and sacrifice, all reduced to ashes in a single sentence. But the final blow came a week later in the lawyer's office. I sat across from his attorney, my hands trembling, expecting to hear the usual. The house, the savings, maybe the beach cottage we dreamed of retiring in. Instead, the lawyer cleared his throat and said softly, Mrs. Whitmore, your husband left a new will. It was updated just 6 months ago. He pushed a thick envelope toward me, and with every word he read aloud, my heart cracked a little more. Robert hadn't left me the house. He hadn't left me the business. He hadn't even left me the wedding ring I gave him on our anniversary. Everything was left to her. The woman from the funeral, and her son. The room spun around me. My ears buzzed. My world, my identity, my past, all stolen by a man I thought I knew. That day, as I walked out of the lawyer's office, I made a silent promise to myself. He might have destroyed my faith, but I would make sure his secrets destroyed him even in death. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, the same table Robert and I had eaten breakfast at every day for 3 decades, staring at the letter his lawyer gave me. It felt strange to see his handwriting again, neat and steady, spelling out betrayal with perfect precision. To my dear wife, Margaret, I trust you will understand that I must provide for Emily and our son, Daniel. Emily, that was her name, the woman from the funeral. The woman who stood in the same church where I had once walked down the aisle, clutching my flowers, trembling with love and hope, and claim my husband as her son's father. I wanted to scream, to break every plate, to tear his picture off the wall. But instead, I just sat there, silent, frozen. I thought about the years, the decades I had spent taking care of him. The time I sold my mother's heirloom bracelet to help him when his business nearly went under. The vacations I skipped because he said, "We need to save money this year, honey." And all along, he was spending that saved money on her. On them. By noon, anger had replaced shock. And by evening, anger had turned into determination. I wasn't going to cry anymore. I was going to find her. Emily lived only 40 minutes away, in a small, two-story house with white shutters and a freshly painted porch. My husband had bought it for her, of course. I found the address in one of the legal documents. When I drove there, the sky was gray and the wind smelled like rain. I sat in the car, staring at the house, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. A little boy played in the front yard, Daniel. His laughter carried through the drizzle. It sounded pure innocent. And for a moment I felt a pang of guilt. None of this was his fault. He was just a child born into someone else's lie. Then the front door opened. Emily stepped out. She was young, maybe 30. Her hair was long and golden, her skin pale. She wore a soft blue sweater, and in her hand she held a mug that said, "World's Best Mom." I wanted to hate her, but when I looked at her face, I saw something unexpected. Fear. She saw me, and her smile faltered. "Mrs. Whitmore," she whispered, as if saying my name would summon ghosts. "Yes," I said calmly, stepping closer. "The other Mrs. Whitmore." Her eyes filled with tears. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. He told me you didn't care about him anymore, that you were just roommates by then." I laughed, a cold, sharp laugh I didn't recognize. That's how he justified 30 years of lies. She looked down, ashamed. I thought he was divorced. I didn't know until it was too late. Her voice trembled, but I wasn't there for pity. I wanted truth, every piece of it. "How long?" I asked. She hesitated. 8 years. 8 years. 8 years he'd been living 2 lives. 8 years of birthday parties, anniversaries, holidays, while I sat home waiting for his calls from business trips. I turned to leave, but she called after me. "Wait." He wanted to make things right. That's why he changed the will. I stopped and looked back at her. "No, Emily. He didn't make things right. He made things final." And as I drove away, the storm broke. Rain poured against the windshield, drowning out my thoughts, except one. If he wanted her to have everything, then fine. She could have the money. She could have the house. But I was going to make sure she learned exactly what it felt like to lose everything too. The house felt emptier than ever that week. Rooms full of ghosts, drawers full of receipts, and a silence that kept folding me inward. Grief had given way to a cold clarity. I couldn't undo his betrayal, but I could peel back the things he'd hidden. I started where anyone who loves numbers and habits begins, his study. Robert kept everything. Paperwork, business cards, old bank statements tucked into boxes he thought I never opened. For 30 years I'd trusted him with the finances. He said money stressed him, that he handled the boring parts. I'd accepted it, believing the story that made us both comfortable. Him, the provider, me, the heart of the home. Now I needed proof. At first the hunt felt childish, rifling through files, flipping through envelopes with hands that still shook. Then, behind a false bottom in his desk drawer, I found the first stubborn truth. a stack of stamped envelopes from a different bank with a different city on the return address. Beneath them, a thin legal pad filled with account numbers and a name I didn't recognize at first. Whitmore Holdings, Offshore Division. My throat tightened. Offshore? That sounded like the sort of thing men hide inside other men's advice. It's prudent, he'd say, for tax reasons. I remembered the late nights when he'd say, I'm sorting the business accounts, while I believed in the golden future we were saving for. 8 years of sorting. I followed the trail. Old check stubs with payees I didn't know. Receipts for jewelry stores in towns we never visited. A deed for a small rental property tucked inside a manila folder labeled Legacy for Emily. I sat on the floor in the study. The papers spread around me like the entrails of a life he thought he could manage without me examining. Between statements, a scribbled note reminded him of anniversary dates, as if haunting himself with memory would soothe the other life. Then, like the last piece of a puzzle, I found a leather-bound journal shoved under the bookshelves. His handwriting, the same steady, careful script he used on the anniversary cards, filled pages where he had mapped his choices, not his love. He had written about keeping things practical and division of assets. He had complained, on paper, about staleness and the need for a fresh start. And there it was in blunt lines. Emily and Daniel provided me a sense of newness. Margaret deserves comfort, but she needn't control it. Control. He'd always called my questions control. A bitter laugh escaped me. He thought he'd divided his life cleanly. Comfort for me, excitement for her, secrecy clean as a cut. But paper keeps secrets differently. Paper doesn't forgive. That night I didn't sleep. The house seemed to listen as I planned. I had the facts now, accounts, deeds, likely transfer dates. I could take them to the lawyer and fight the proper way. But something older, quieter rose in me. Proper felt insufficient for 30 years of being sidelined, for birthdays spent alone, for the way his laughter had echoed in rooms that suddenly weren't mine. So I did 2 things. First, I copied everything, scanned statements, photographed notes, made a neat file like a surgeon preparing instruments. Second, I took the file to an old friend, Miriam, who'd once run a small accounting firm and owed me a dozen favors after I'd nursed her through her divorce. She looked through the papers, eyes narrowing, lips pursed. You want to hurt him where it counts, she asked finally. No, I said. I want to make sure the truth has teeth. Miriam smiled, not cruelly, but with the precise satisfaction of someone who knows how the law and money bend. We don't burn bridges, Margaret. We make sure they can't cross them anymore. Plans were hatched quietly. A forensic audit, a subpoena for offshore accounts, a careful legal avenue that would not look like a spiteful widow's tantrum, but the rightful unearthing of fraud and deception. I'd take him on with the thing he prized most: order, scale, control, and show how those very structures could be dismantled. As the first drops of rain started on the window, I let the papers fall into a stack and breathed. For the first time since the funeral, my hands weren't trembling from shock. They were steady with purpose. He had thought he'd left me everything and kept everything else. He was wrong. The truth is patient. And so was I. The day of the will reading arrived, like a storm I couldn't avoid. The lawyer's office sat in a tall glass building downtown, too modern, too bright for grief. I wore black again, not for Robert this time, but for the woman I had been before all of this, the trusting wife, the believer. She was gone now, buried alongside him. When I stepped into the conference room, I froze. Emily was already there. She looked nervous, her fingers twisting around a tissue. And beside her sat a boy, Daniel, dressed in a small navy suit. He couldn't have been more than 7. His eyes reminded me of Robert's, and that alone felt like a dagger twisting deeper. The lawyer, Mr. Bennet, cleared his throat. Mrs. Whitmore, Mrs. Davis, he paused, acknowledging both of us. Thank you for coming. This will take a while. Let's get on with it, I said, my voice steady but colder than I meant. He opened the file and began reading in that detached tone lawyer's perfect. I, Robert Whitmore, being of sound mind and body, do hereby leave my estate to be divided as follows. I didn't breathe. I listened. Every word felt like a countdown to another betrayal. To my wife, Margaret Whitmore, I leave the lake cabin and its contents, as well as a monthly allowance from my business accounts for her continued comfort. I blinked. The cabin? The one that hadn't been used in 10 years. A wooden box rotting in the woods. That was my reward for 30 years of loyalty? Mr. Bennet continued. To Emily Davis, I leave the family home at 42 Willow Lane, along with all joint savings accounts under my name, and the sum of $500,000 to be used for the care and education of our son, Daniel. The room went silent. I heard only the hum of the air conditioner and the rush of blood in my ears. My fingers tightened around the arm of the chair. I could feel the pulse in my wrist hammering like war drums. I wanted to scream. Our son? He'd written it down, legitimized the lie with ink. Emily's face was pale. She didn't look proud or smug, just shattered. Maybe she hadn't expected to be mentioned so openly either. Maybe she'd been a victim of his half-truths too. But sympathy didn't matter. The damage was done. Mr. Bennet read the final clause. In the event of my passing, I trust both families will honor my memory by finding peace with one another. Love, after all, is never perfect, but it is always real. I laughed, a brittle, bitter sound that startled even me. Real, I said softly. He called this real? Mr. Bennet looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Whitmore, I understand this is difficult. Difficult? I cut in. No, Mr. Bennet. Losing your husband to death is difficult. Losing him to another family is devastation. Emily's eyes brimmed with tears. Please, I didn't ask for any of this. I turned to her, my voice low but sharp. Neither did I. I stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the polished floor. He thought this would tie up his life neatly, make his guilt disappear with his signature. But he forgot something. I leaned in slightly. The dead can't control the living. And with that, I walked out, past the receptionist's polite smile, past the glass doors that reflected the woman I no longer recognized. Outside, the city buzzed with indifference. People hurried by, cars honked, life went on. But inside me, something shifted, something fierce and alive. Robert thought he'd written the end of the story. But it wasn't over. Not yet. I was done being the quiet widow. I was going to rewrite the ending. One that would make sure everyone remembered Margaret Whitmore, not as the betrayed wife, but as the woman who took back everything she'd lost. The morning after the will reading, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the blinds, warm and golden, mocking me with its normalcy. The world was still spinning, even though mine had stopped weeks ago. But this time I didn't feel hollow. I felt sharp. clear, like glass that had been shattered and remade into something dangerous. Robert had written me off, given me scraps of comfort, and called it kindness. He'd left the rest of his fortune and his so-called legacy to a woman half my age and a child I hadn't known existed. But if he thought I'd quietly fade away, he had underestimated the woman who built his life beside him. He left me the lake cabin, the one we hadn't visited in a decade. It had always been my favorite place once, before he stopped going with me. That was my first clue something was wrong. So, I decided to go back. If the law said the cabin was mine, then that's where I would rebuild. And perhaps, just perhaps, that's where I'd start to undo his perfect plan. When I arrived, the air smelled of pine and damp earth. The cabin was still standing, barely. Dust covered everything, but his things were still there. Fishing rods, his old books, a few photographs we'd taken years ago. He'd kept them here, hidden away like relics of a life he'd once wanted to remember. I opened one of the old drawers looking for candles, and instead, I found a small metal box. Inside were documents, bank slips, and an old USB drive labeled Investments 2015 to 2023. My heart pounded. If there was one thing Robert loved more than control, it was secrecy. And secrecy always left traces. I took the drive home, plugged it into my laptop, and watched as files opened one by one. Investment portfolios, transfers to offshore accounts, and tucked among them a few labeled folders, one named D Future. I clicked it open. Photos, videos, messages, a private life meticulously archived, birthdays, school events, vacations, all with Emily and their son. I felt tears sting my eyes, but I refused to cry again. Not now, because as much as those files hurt, they also told me something Robert never expected me to learn. He hadn't transferred everything yet. The accounts listed in those documents showed joint signatures, pending transfers, and partial ownerships, which meant legally they weren't sealed. And since I was still his lawful wife, my name appeared on several of those records. He'd planned to complete the transfer just weeks before his death, but fate, it seemed, had interrupted him. I drove to Miriam's house that night, clutching a printout of everything I'd found. She opened the door, her face softening when she saw me. "You look like a woman with a mission," she said. "I am," I replied, "and I need your help." She scanned the documents, her eyes widening. "Margaret, these are massive. If this is accurate, you could contest the will, not just emotionally, but legally." "I don't want to contest," I said, shaking my head. "I want to dismantle." He tried to build two worlds, one built on lies, one built on loyalty. "I'll make sure they collapse together." Miriam smiled, that slow, dangerous smile she used to wear when she caught a mistake in someone's books. "Then let's give the dead man a lesson in consequences." We spent hours drawing up steps, filing delays, freezing assets, quietly alerting the bank about disputed transactions. Every move precise, calm, and deliberate. By the time I left her house, the stars were out, sharp and cold against the dark sky. I stood by my car and looked up. "You wanted 2 lives, Robert," I whispered. "Now neither will rest in peace until I'm done." I wasn't seeking chaos or money anymore. I was seeking balance. And sometimes balance demands a storm. The first ripple arrived as a polite email from a bank, pending review of account activity. "Ava, no, Emily," read it standing in her kitchen, a mug half raised to her lips. She frowned, tapped the screen, and assumed it was an error. Tyler would handle it, she told herself. He always handled the money. 2 days later, the venue called. "We're unable to process the deposit," the coordinator said, voice squeezed with professional calm. "Our records indicate the transaction was reversed." Emily's hand went numb. She posted a story to calm the bridesmaids, just a hiccup, smiley face, but privately she typed and deleted and typed again, breath shallow. Then the messages began. Suppliers, the photographer, the florist. Voices that had once sung planning platitudes turned brittle and frantic. The one from Tyler was short and dangerous. "You fix this now." She called the bank. Hold music hummed like a pulse in her ear. A voice finally. "Ma'am, we flagged multiple transfers." In light of an inquiry, accounts linked to Mr. Whitmore are under temporary freeze, pending forensic review. Her stomach dropped. Forensic review. She stared at the boy playing with blocks on the floor. Daniel, so trusting, so innocent, and felt the floor slip from under her. Panic spread through Emily like wildfire. She ran to the house where the guest list was pinned up in neat columns and ripped it down as if that would unravel the problem. She texted friends, begged them to keep things hush-hush. She called her father's lawyer. There was no answer. Someone finally told her in a voice softer than she deserved, "We're trying to reach Mrs. Whitmore." There are legal inquiries. A week in, and the reality set in. The accounts were frozen. The house deed? Under review. The elegant life Robert had quietly funded looked like a fragile paper theater. Invitations turned to questions. Guests canceled, not out of spite, but because they could feel the ground shifting. Emily's anger was volcanic. She paced, slammed drawers, and took Daniel to relatives more often, trying to protect him from the storms she'd helped construct. She phoned Miriam the accountant once, trying to bargain, to buy delay. Miriam's voice was cool as steel. "This is a legal investigation, Emily. Money trails don't lie. If your name appears on records obtained by the audit, there will be questions you'll have to answer." At first, the town gave her room for sympathy. After all, she was a young widow with a child. But then gossip found rhythm. People knit theories out of scraps. Infidelity, fraud, complicity. The neighbors who once nodded politely turned their heads. Her mother's friends sent condolence casseroles, then quietly accepted returns. Emily tried to storm my house once, hands clawing at the doorframe, eyes hollow with exhausted wrath. "This is your doing," she spat. "You went to Miriam. You wanted to hurt me." I watched her through the window as she raged, and for a long moment I felt 1,000 things. Vindication, sorrow, a deep, aching pity. No, I'd tell her later, gently, when the sirens of crisis quieted. I wanted truth. But in that thunder of her anger, I understood the scale of what I'd unleashed. Not just legal correction, but collapse. The life she had accepted, beautiful dresses, private schools, unasked for luxuries, was proving to be a house built on sand. The hardest blow was Daniel's confusion. He asked simple, child-sized questions as if all of this were a bad dream. "Where's Grandpa's money, Grandma?" he asked one bright morning, thumb in his mouth. He didn't know about wills or frozen accounts. He only knew the warmth of pocketed treasures suddenly gone. When Emily finally sat down across from me that night, she was different, raw, humbled, drained of the easy superiority that had once come so naturally. Her defenses cracked, not into apologies, but into small, sharp lessons. You could have come to me, she whispered. You could have talked. I did, I said quietly. For 30 years. You only listened to the version you wanted to hear. She looked at Daniel asleep on the couch, and the sight of her child softened the edges of her anger. She pressed her hands to her face and wept. Not about the ruined wedding, not about pride, but about the precariousness of trust. The town's whispers would be slow and cruel, but the legal machinery I'd set in motion was cleaner, colder, and undeniable. This was no melodrama birthed from spite. It was consequence. The truth had teeth, the paper trails bit. And for the first time since the funeral, the quiet woman who once answered to everyone else's rhythm felt the tide moving in her direction. She was crumbling, and in the ruin, something fragile and honest began to grow. By the time the rain stopped, the town smelled like wet pavement and second chances. But there was no chance for Emily, at least not the kind she'd imagined. The freeze had worsened into an audit. Suppliers demanded answers. Neighbors exchanged glances. The gossip, once idle, now had an edge of proof. Miriam called that morning before I had my coffee. Margaret, she said, voice clipped, you need to sit down. I found something. My stomach folded inward. What is it? Not what, who? She met me at the kitchen table with a folder thicker than any I'd seen yet. Inside were bank printouts, signed forms, and at the bottom, a photocopy of a document that made my hands go cold, a notarized statement from 2 years ago, apparently signed by me, transferring partial ownership of one business account to Emily Davis. The signature was mine, clear as the morning sun. My throat closed. I began. I know. Miriam put a steadying hand on mine. Neither did the town. But signatures can be copied, and notaries can be fooled. Look here. She tapped the margin where a tiny irregularity sat like a splinter. The notary stamp is from a town office across the county. Robert had connections there. Emily made sure those transfers appeared legitimate on paper. A memory surfaced. A casual visit Robert had said he made to sort paperwork for some civic matter. How many quiet errands had he used to stitch their other life into legal cloth? How easily had he sewn my name into their fabric, as if I'd given my own blessing? We dug deeper. Emails, text messages, a string of cheerful messages between Robert and Emily, and then between Emily and a local paralegal who'd apparently arranged the paperwork. There were invoices paid in cash. There were meetings scheduled at cafes where I never went. There was even a worried message from a neighbor who'd seen Emily leaving the town office late at night waving a small envelope. The evidence built like a wall. Not proof of malice at first glance. Perhaps common sense might call it messy love turned pragmatic. But then Miriam found the clincher, a scanned PDF of a bank authorization form signed in my name, dated 2 months before Robert's update to the will. The metadata showed it was created on a laptop registered to Emily Davis. I stared at the printout until the letters blurred. She copied it? I whispered. She did, Miriam said quietly. Or had someone do it. Either way, Margaret, the law sees that as fraud. The authorities will want to talk. Her eyes were sympathetic, but resolute. I can help clean this up legally, but you must be prepared for the fallout. The fallout arrived quicker than I expected. When I called Emily to meet, not at my house, but at the town legal aid office where neutral ground might keep veins from popping, she arrived with a face like a carefully folded paper crane, too neat to trust. Daniel clutched her skirt. His eyes darted to me and then away. I placed the documents on the table between us. "Do you know what this is?" I asked. She swallowed hotly. Her fingers trembled. "You have no right," she began, voice brittle, then stopped when I looked at her without hate. "Tell me the truth, Emily." Her composure cracked like thin glass. She reached for the papers, then recoiled as if burned. He said you were no longer with him. He said you wanted to be left alone. He said to do what I needed to keep our son safe. I trusted him. You trusted him enough to sign my name?" I asked, each word a careful knife. She sobbed then, not theatrical, but raw. "I didn't forge the signatures. I asked for help from someone who knew paperwork. I thought if everything looked right, no one would get hurt." "Did you ever ask if I wanted anything?" I asked quietly. "Did you ever consider that the woman you called an obstacle was the one who changed your diapers, who taught your husband to love the smell of coffee?" Her eyes met mine, and there was something in them like a child seeing the truth for the first time. "No," she breathed. "We were both lied to. But I never wanted to hurt you." "Lies don't care for intentions," Miriam said, calm as winter. "They care about facts." She reached for her phone. "We can report this, criminal charges for forgery and fraud. Or we can negotiate a settlement, supervised transfers, full restitution. The law will decide what happens next." Emily buried her face in her hands. Daniel looked from her to me. Confusion written across his small features, and I felt a sharp, inexplicable pity. I had wanted the truth. I wanted the estate and the accounts exposed. I wanted justice for the years of deceit. I hadn't wanted to destroy a child's life, but the ledger of life is often written in ink. Someone had spent my years, my trust, and my nights of waiting. If using the law to untangle lies meant a child would suffer temporarily, then the cost would be paid by truth's tough medicine. I stood, smoothing my skirt. "We will not ruin him any more than he ruined himself," I said. "But the town needs to know the whole story." Emily whispered, "Please, Margaret." "Not everything." I met her eyes. "Everything," I said, "for Daniel's sake." She nodded, and in her nod there was a surrender that felt almost like relief. When we left the office, the air beyond the glass smelled like a storm just gone. The town remained unaware of the judicial poetry about to unfold. But the lines were drawn. The players knew their marks. The rest would be a performance with law as director and truth as the script. And I, the woman who had been betrayed, would not blink. The courthouse was cold, not from the air conditioning, but from the kind of chill that seeps into your bones when justice is about to dig up the past. The marble floor echoed with each step I took, and for a moment I felt every year of my age. My heart wasn't racing out of fear anymore. It was something else, a deep, righteous calm. Emily sat 2 rows ahead, clutching a worn handkerchief. Her lawyer, a young man with more confidence than compassion, whispered in her ear. Across the aisle sat my attorney, Miriam, her folders neatly stacked, eyes sharp like polished glass. She looked at me and gave a small nod. "Are you ready, Margaret?" "As ready as I'll ever be." The case wasn't criminal yet, not officially. It was a hearing about the legitimacy of Robert's will, the disputed accounts, and the alleged forgery. But everyone knew it was more than that. It was about truth finally stepping out from the shadows, about dignity being restored. When the judge entered, the room stood silent. He was an older man with silver hair and tired eyes, someone who'd seen too many families destroyed by greed. "Let's begin," he said. Miriam started with calm precision. She presented evidence, the bank documents, the metadata, the fake notary stamps. With each slide projected on the screen, Emily's shoulders sank lower. The audience, a small cluster of townsfolk, reporters, and curious neighbors, whispered among themselves. Then came the moment of confrontation. "Mrs. Davis," Miriam said, turning toward Emily, "is this your signature authorizing the transfer of funds from Mrs. Margaret Holloway's account?" Emily hesitated. Her lips trembled. I didn't mean to." "It's a yes or no question." Tears welled in Emily's eyes. "Yes, but I thought it was right. Robert told me it was his money to move." "And did you confirm that with Mrs. Holloway?" "No," her voice broke. "I didn't." The judge leaned forward. "You understand the seriousness of falsifying documents, Mrs. Davis? Even if you believed your late partner, the law does not recognize ignorance as innocence." Emily nodded weakly. Her lawyer tried to interject, but the damage was done. When it was my turn to speak, the courtroom hushed. I rose slowly, steadying myself against the wooden table. "Your Honor," I began, "I'm not here to punish anyone. I'm here because my name, my life's work, was used without my consent. I spent 50 years building the stability Robert and I shared. And while he may have lost his way, I refuse to let deceit rewrite my story." The judge listened carefully. "And what do you seek, Mrs. Holloway?" I looked at Emily, whose face was buried in her hands. "I want the truth to be known. I want my husband's legacy corrected, and I want my name cleared. As for Mrs. Davis and her son, I don't want them destitute, but they will live on what's rightfully theirs, no more, no less." A murmur spread through the room. Surprise, maybe even respect. The judge made his notes. After what felt like an eternity, he said, "The evidence supports Mrs. Holloway's claim. The signatures were forged. The financial transfers are invalid. All assets will revert to Mrs. Holloway's estate, pending reallocation. As for Mrs. Davis, charges for forgery may be considered pending review." The gavel struck once hard. It was done. Emily sobbed quietly, while Daniel, too young to understand, too innocent to carry blame, sat beside her, clutching a small toy car. For a moment, my heart softened. I approached them as people filed out. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted to steal your life." I looked at her, not as an enemy, but as a reflection of every broken promise Robert had made. "You didn't steal it," I said softly. "You just tried to live in its shadow. But shadows don't last forever." Her tears fell freely now. "What will you do with everything?" "Live," I said simply, "the way I should have long ago." As I walked out of the courtroom, the late afternoon light streamed through the tall windows, golden and forgiving. The town outside buzzed with whispers, but I no longer cared. The truth was free, and so was I. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the calm, a new idea began to bloom. One last act not of revenge, but of revelation. Something that would make the world remember Robert for what he was and me for what I became after him. The week after the courtroom felt strange, quieter, as if the town itself were inhaling and holding its breath. People nodded at me in the grocery store with a new sort of deferential curiosity. Some avoided my gaze like children caught eavesdropping on a secret. The phone calls slowed. The gossip that had been a roaring river after the audit swelled into a steady current of opinion. and I watched it from the bank like someone who had learned to stand on higher ground. But I hadn't come this far to sink into comfort. Miriam and I had talked late into the night after the judge's decision. "You've taken the law's victory," she'd said, "but if you want this to be more than a personal win, if you want the truth to land where it will change behavior, you have to make it public in a different way. Make it real for people who simply didn't believe deception could live in their neighbor's house." We needed more than papers. We needed a mirror. So I rented the little gallery on Main Street, the one that hosted quilting clubs and high school art shows. It was small, but its windows faced the busiest corner in town, and its owner, a sympathetic woman named Clara, agreed to help without asking questions. We called the exhibit Paper Trails. I wanted it blunt and unavoidable. On opening night, I stood at the back of the crowded room while Clara made her short speech. The walls had been decorated with reproductions of the documents Miriam and I had uncovered, but not as cold printouts. They were arranged like an artist's collage. The will excerpt looping into a calendar of Robert's business trips, into photos of birthday cakes, into the check stubs, into the forgery photocopy. Each piece layered so viewers could read the story without hearing a lawyer's voice. At the center, under a single soft light, was a framed photo of Robert and me from decades ago, the two of us younger, laughing by the lake. Beneath it, a plaque read, "This story begins with a love that deserved better than lies." People came in hushes. They read. Faces shifted, confusion, recognition, shame. I could see fingers point to dates, to signatures, to the places where the trail crossed from innocent negligence into calculated replacement. Reporters arrived. The legal press took interest. Someone videotaped. Someone else took a photo for the paper. I watched Emily walk slowly through the exhibit, her hand over her mouth, Daniel clinging to her coat. She didn't shove the papers aside. She read the whole thing like a child reading a story for the first time and realizing the villain was someone she'd loved. When she reached the framed photo, she sank into a chair. People murmured. A woman from my knitting group went to her, squeezed her hand. My son, who had watched this all unfold from the sidelines, arrived late and stood at the back, his face gray with a sorrow he hadn't expected. I walked to the front and simply told the truth. I didn't dramatize. I didn't accuse beyond the facts. I read short passages, the will clause as it stood, the forged document, the emails that stitched the months together. I let the paper do the work. Truth, I had learned, doesn't need a theatrical voice. When I finished, a quiet hung in the gallery like a held breath that didn't want to be released. Then a woman in the front row stood up. She was the owner of the cafe on Elm Street. "I've always suspected," she said, voice trembling, "but seeing it like this, how could anyone have looked away?" That question rang in the room. Before the night ended, I made an announcement that surprised more than a few of the gathered guests. "I will not hoard what's come back to me," I said. "Robert tried to divide us with secrecy. I will divide it with light." I explained the fund Miriam and I had drawn up, a trust to help single parents return to school, to support children like Daniel in safe, transparent accounts, and to educate the community about financial fraud. Daniel would have resources for school that could not be touched by anyone but a designated trustee chosen for his welfare. Emily, if she wished, could apply to manage a portion of the community outreach program, but only after training and oversight. It was mercy shaped by rules. Some people cried. Others clapped. Emily came to me then, shook, eyes wet. "What are you doing?" she whispered. "Turning pain into something they can't bury," I replied. "Justice without cruelty." I put out my hand. She took it. For a moment we were simply two women, tired and real. As the crowd dispersed and the last of the lights dimmed, I stepped outside into the cool night. The street was quiet, the stars a punctuation. I thought about Robert, about the small ease of his lies and the mess he left. I thought about the child asleep in the chair back home, and about the woman who had once called me mother and now had to learn to be someone new. This wasn't revenge for revenge's sake. This was a reclamation of dignity, a refusal to let lies pass without consequence. The town would talk about the exhibit for months. People would remember the collage of paper, the framed photos, the woman who had stood up and made the truth visible. And somewhere in the hush that followed, a different kind of power rose inside me. Not the thrill of victory, but the steady warmth of a life mended not by revenge alone, but by the courage to make the broken parts useful. The final act would come soon. There was one more scene to write that would close the circle for Robert, for Emily, and for me. Spring came early that year, or maybe I just noticed it more. The lilacs bloomed before their time, the mornings were lighter, and the house no longer echoed with bitterness. For months after the gallery exhibit, peace had settled around me like a well-worn shawl. It wasn't perfect, but it was earned. I stood by the window, the same one where I'd once watched Robert drive away for his business trips. The sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, painting gold across the photos on my mantel. One of them, the picture of Robert and me by the lake, had stayed right where it always was. I never removed it. Some memories are meant to remain, not as wounds, but as reminders of how deeply we can survive betrayal and still find grace. Then one morning a letter came, handwritten, from Emily. It wasn't long, just a few pages, but it was soaked in the kind of regret that comes too late for apologies, yet still heavy with hope. "I don't expect forgiveness," she wrote, "but I want you to know I've been volunteering at the Trust Foundation. I tell people your story, not to make myself the villain, but to help others recognize what love looks like when it turns blind. Daniel asks about you all the time. He wants to visit. If you'll have us." For the first time in months, I felt tears fall, not from anger, but from release. I replied the next day. "Come for tea on Sunday," I wrote. "The garden is blooming again. I think we're both ready to see what grows after the storm." When Sunday came, I baked a small lemon cake, the same recipe Robert used to love, though this time it wasn't for him. It was for us, for healing. The knock at the door was hesitant. When I opened it, Daniel ran to me first, taller now, shy but smiling. "Grandma," he said softly, "Mom says we can plant flowers today." Emily stood behind him, pale, eyes rimmed red. There were no rehearsed words, no excuses, just a quiet, trembling moment of recognition. She looked older, not by years, but by experience, the kind of growth that only comes from being forced to face the truth. "I didn't know what I was doing," she whispered. "I thought loving him meant protecting his secrets." I reached out and held her hands. And now I know love without truth isn't love at all. We spent the afternoon in the garden. Daniel dug little holes for seeds, his laughter cutting through the soft hum of spring. Emily helped trim the rose bushes while I poured tea. For the first time, It didn't feel like two sides of a broken family trying to patch themselves together. It felt like something new, something honest. As the sun began to set, I told them something I hadn't told anyone. I've decided to sell this house, I said gently. Not because I want to run from memories, but because I've lived enough of my life in this chapter. I want to spend what time I have seeing the world I missed while waiting for someone else to love me right. Emily looked startled. Where will you go? Anywhere my heart takes me, I smiled. Maybe Paris. Maybe the sea. Maybe just a smaller town where I can sit by a window and watch strangers walk by without wondering what they're hiding. She nodded, eyes glistening. Can we visit? Always, I said. But next time, bring honesty with you. It's the only gift I want. As the last light faded, I stood alone on the porch, watching them drive away. The air was cool, the sky painted with streaks of lavender and gold. I thought about Robert, his charm, his secrets, the mess he left behind, and realized I no longer hated him. Pity, maybe. But hate had no place in this new life. He'd built his world on lies. I rebuilt mine on truth. And for the first time in a long, long while, I felt free. I turned back toward the house, closed the door, and whispered to the empty rooms. You didn't ruin me, Robert. You revealed me. Then I smiled, a quiet, knowing smile, and began packing for my next journey. Because the story didn't end with his betrayal. It began with my rebirth.